Ladies and gentlemen, we begin our class tonight. It is good to see each of you. We have visitors in our class. Thank you for being here this evening. We're resuming our study in the book of Hebrews. We began the study last Sunday morning, and we resume this evening. We'll be doing this now for the next 3 months, this month and then the 2 that come after. The study in the book of Hebrews is one of the richest and most rewarding studies I think that we can engage in. The Bible in every place has information that is valuable and good for us. But the book of Hebrews presents to us, I think, Jesus in such a way that we can appreciate him for all that he is, for all that he has done for us. The book of Hebrews presents Christ as the very center of everything. And it's about the superiority of Jesus. If we were to give one brief title to the book of Hebrews, it's that Jesus is better than the old covenant, better than the old priesthood, better than the prophets of old, better than Moses, better than the angels, and his covenant, of course, is also going to be better. We appreciate you being here tonight. As we resume our study, let's begin with a word of prayer tonight. Let's bow. Our Father and our God in heaven, we humble ourselves before you, thanking you for the book of Hebrews and for the powerful message that it has regarding our Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Help us, God, as we study, to learn to take these principles into our hearts and learn to follow him more closely. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, this past Sunday morning, we were introducing the book of Hebrews. We talked some about the background of the book, that many of the brethren at this time were very much discouraged. The title Hebrews itself, I think, comes from the idea that there were people who were known as Hebrews, okay? Not necessarily in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, those Jews who were born and raised in Palestine were typically called Hebrews. Those Jews who were from other places outside of Palestine were called Grecians. They weren't necessarily Greek, but they were Jews who were outside of Palestine. But the Jews who lived in Jerusalem, Judea, and the rest of Palestine had a special problem. They were under intense persecution, and many of them were tempted to give up on Jesus. The book of Hebrews shows them why they must not do that. That really is the fundamental background of the book. We're not sure who the author of Hebrews is, and in the end, it really doesn't make any difference. The text is inspired by God, and that's all that we really care about. As to the date of writing, the book of Hebrews was evidently written prior to 70 A.D. As we go through the book, we're going to learn that the temple was still standing and that the old covenant, the sacrifices and things of that nature were still being practiced, which says that it's prior to 70 A.D. Why do we say that? What was it that happened in 70 A.D. that changed everything? Destruction of Jerusalem, and the temple was destroyed. That's right, the Romans came against Jerusalem. Of course, Jerusalem was already subject to Rome, but there came in the late 60s a rebellion against Rome. And the Roman government said, we've had enough of this, and they crushed the rebellion and destroyed the city, even dismantling the temple stone by stone, fulfilling the prophecy of Jesus found in Matthew chapter 24. And so when you see that there are references to the temple that is still standing, this tells you that the book of Hebrews was very likely written prior to the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. My judgment is that likely Paul was the author. There are arguments pro and con, and if this was written by Paul, it very likely was written while he was in prison during his imprisonment at Rome, maybe around 63 or 64 A.D. But it's written. What's the purpose? The purpose of this epistle is to encourage the saints who had been discouraged. Some of them were considering abandoning their faith in Jesus. You can't do that. That's a terrible, terrible mistake, the biggest mistake anyone could ever make. And so he writes to encourage these Hebrew Christians not to go back to the old law. And what he does, he shows the superiority of Jesus. There's nothing in the law that can compare to Jesus. He shows the superiority of the new covenant. The old covenant cannot compare to the new. One of the phrases that you will find over and over again in the book of Hebrews is the term better. Better things, better covenant, better sacrifice, better hope. All this terminology is designed to let the people know and encourage them that they've got the very best that God has to offer. And so do not give up your hope. The ordinances of the law of Moses comprise a major part of the book of Hebrews, chapter 7, 8, and 9 in particular, and part of chapter 10. Because what the writer does, he goes back and looks at some of these things under the law of Moses and then puts them in contrast to the better things that we have in Christ. And he uses a couple of terms to describe those things in the law of Moses. Does anybody know what those terms are? The terms of comparison. It's an idea of types and shadows, that these things under Moses' law were only a shadow of what was to come. They were types of what was to come. That is, there was similarity between these things and what was to come under the new covenant. But his point that he's making in looking at all these things was that what we have under the new covenant is superior. Well, that pretty much covers the introduction that we did this past Lord's Day. Anyone have any questions they'd like to have addressed at this time? You got a question? Comment at this time. Okay? Larry? Larry is pointing out one of the points of superiority of the new covenant. The old law, the law of Moses, pertained only to the Jewish people. It was not a law for the whole world. Now, God had law for the other nations. For those of you who are participating in our Bible reading for this year, what we call the Prophets Project, if you have read the book of Amos, the opening of the book of Amos talks about the Phoenicians, Tyre and Sidon. The Phoenicians, it talks about the people of Edom and Moab and other nations. God held these other nations accountable. They had law, but the law of Moses was given only to the Jewish people. And that is so hard for people to grasp because most people believe that the law that was received at Sinai was a law for the whole world. And it simply was not the case. If it was a law for the whole world, what would have set the Jewish people apart? What would have made them special if everybody had this law? So Larry makes a good point. And the superiority then of the new covenant is that it is one that can be enjoyed by every person, whether they're Jewish or Gentile. I'm assuming that everyone in the audience knows the difference between Jew and Gentile. The Jew, that's the people from the nation of Israel. The word Gentile means the other nations. It didn't make any difference if you were from here, there, or anywhere. If you were not of the nation of Israel, you were a Gentile. The term Gentile means the other nations. Okay, good observation. Superiority of the new covenant extends to all mankind. Anything else, questions or comments or observation at this point? I am going to go then to the next page, which puts us on page 3 of our workbook. And page 3, and here I have the 3 major things that I want you to see. Remember, we talked about how Hebrews shows the superiority of Christ and shows the superiority of the new covenant. And here, if you look at the middle of page 3, or the first half of page 3, you will see that the book of Hebrews breaks down very easily into 3 sections. This is the easiest book in the Bible to outline. In understanding any book, it's always valuable to outline the book. That is, to break it down into sections, and the writer talks about this, and then he's got this point, and then another point, okay? And in these three things, you'll see here, we've got it broken down into superiority of the Son. Superiority of the Son is the first, and that covers the first 7 chapters and a part of chapter 8. The first 7 and part of chapter 8. And then if you look at the second part, it starts at chapter 8 and goes through chapter 10. That's the superiority of the new covenant. And then you've got exhortations from the superiority of Christ. And what we mean by exhortations, here's practical things that you ought to do, things that you ought to live out in your life because Jesus is superior and because the new covenant is superior. Now, I didn't put the entire outline. I just put this three-point skeleton on my slide. However, as you look at the outline, it's very easy to grasp. Notice under superiority of the Son, there's 4 points, A, B, C, and D. First of all, he is better than the prophets. The very first thing that the Hebrew writer introduces in the book is the prophets and how God spoke by the prophets. In fact, let's turn now in our Bibles to the book of Hebrews, and I want us to see the opening verses of the book, Hebrews chapter 1, and beginning at verse number 1. It says, God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets. Notice, he starts right off by talking about how God spoke to the prophets. But, notice verse 2, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds. And he's got more to say in verses 3 and 4 about Jesus and his position. But everything mentioned in verses 3 and 4, in fact, everything mentioned in verses 2, 3, and 4, did not apply to the Old Testament prophets, showing the superiority of Jesus. He's a superior spokesman to the prophets of the Old Testament. And then as you continue to look at your outline in your workbook, notice under B, he is portrayed as being better than the angels. That's chapter 1, verse 4, and continuing through all the way through chapter 2. And that he is superior to the angels. Then next, you've got chapter 3 and chapter 4, he is better than Moses. And then finally, he is better than Aaron. And so when you look at these 4 things, better than the prophets, better than the angels, better than Moses, better than Aaron, there's a specific point being made on each of those. And the point that's being made when it speaks of Jesus as better than the prophets, he is superior as a spokesman to mankind. Better than the angels were often used in God's plan in the Old Testament. In fact, the angels were even used in giving the law at Mount Sinai. And yet, in the giving of the law, they were used by God, but they're still inferior to Jesus, the Son. So he is better than the angels because it's not an angel who has come to earth to make known the will of God. It is the Son of God who has come to earth. So you can see the superiority there. Then better than Moses. You know, Moses did so much, and he gave the law at Sinai through the ministration of angels. He governed Israel for a period of time. But Moses, as good a man as Moses was, and as valuable as he was in the plan of God, Moses was still a person who struggled in his life. Would it be proper to say that Moses was a sinner? Yeah, just like the rest of us. But here you have Jesus, who is the Son of God, and he is over all. Then you've got Aaron. Aaron had a priesthood. It was the priesthood out of the tribe of Levi. In order to be a priest under the old law, you had to be of the tribe of Levi, 12 tribes of Israel, one tribe set aside for priesthood. But not everybody in Levi was to be a priest. Only the family of Aaron, the sons of Aaron. And the eldest son was the high priest. And so it was, the priesthood in the Old Testament was very, very narrow. It's sometimes called the Aaronic priesthood after Aaron, sometimes called the Levitical priesthood after Levi. But however you might speak of it, it is inferior to Jesus. Jesus has a better priesthood. And so already this idea of Jesus being better, notice again those 4 points under 1A. He is better than the prophets, better than the angels, better than Moses, and better than Aaron. And so what we see is what I've been pointing out here then on the slide, that the superiority of the Son is primarily the thesis, the essay that he presents first in the book of Hebrews. Then next, in chapter 8, verse 6 beginning, and through chapter 10, verse 18, the writer speaks of the superiority of the new covenant. It would not do to have a superior spokesman, a superior priest, who gives an inferior covenant. Would you agree? If Jesus is superior, then the covenant that he gives has to be superior also. And again, the theme of better, better, better is found. Notice the 3 points under superiority of the new covenant. The new covenant is based on better promises. That's what chapter 8 says. The new covenant is based upon a better sanctuary. That's chapter 9. And then the new covenant is based on a better sacrifice. That's chapter 10. And so when you look at this, I want you to think about this. People regard the book of Hebrews as being so difficult. And I'm not going to say that every verse is easy in the book. But can you see some logic and simplicity to this argument, to the structure of the book, that Jesus is better and his covenant is better? Does that make sense? Anybody struggle in understanding that? Jesus is better, the new covenant is better. And once we grasp this idea that that's the thrust of the book, that's what the writer's intent is to give, to teach us the better about the new covenant, about Jesus, then the book really becomes relatively easy to understand. Now, when we get into chapter 6 and chapter 7 and run across this fellow named Melchizedek, people then get lost sometimes in that. And you're going to see that when we get there, you're going to see that it's not really that hard. But someone says, well, I have so many questions about Melchizedek. Well, so does everybody. And that's one of the reasons why Melchizedek is used. Someone says, I want to know where he came from. Who were his parents? And what about his children? Was he married? Did he have children? That's the reason Melchizedek is used, because there was no genealogy given for him. His parents are not listed in any genealogy. Melchizedek was both a king and a priest in the city of Jerusalem, and Jesus is compared to him because there's no one else in the Old Testament who is like Melchizedek. Melchizedek was king and priest in Jerusalem, but he had no genealogy. There was no kingship that he came from. In other words, his father wasn't a king, grandfather wasn't a king, and so on. And that's the reason that he's used. And so a lot of questions that people have about Melchizedek, they're never going to be able to answer. And that's because the Hebrew writer wants to show you that this man is unique. There was no other king, no other man in the Old Testament, both king and priest, like him. Was David a king? And all the people said yes, okay? David was a king. Was he a priest? No. Was Aaron a priest? Yes, he was high priest. But was he a king? No. Eleazar, a descendant of Aaron, he was a high priest, but he wasn't a king. As great as David was, his son Solomon was even greater in many senses. But was Solomon a priest? You go through all of the kings of the Old Testament, and not one is a priest, except Melchizedek. You go through all the priests of the Old Testament, not one is a king, except Melchizedek. And the point that is being made in showing us the superiority of Jesus is that the only thing he could be compared to was this man Melchizedek, because Jesus is both king and priest at the same time. No other examples. It goes all the way back to Melchizedek in the time of Abraham. Abraham, by the way, was neither a king nor a priest. And so there are just so many things about Jesus. Jesus is better. That's the point being made. Then looking at the third section here, exhortations from the superiority of Christ. Okay, this is where he gets into the business of being faithful. Now, up to this time, he's given all this doctrinal teaching about Jesus and about the new covenant. But now he says, because of all this that we have and all this better stuff that's in the new covenant, we need to hold fast to Jesus. Hold on. Look over in Hebrews chapter 10. And typically when we go to Hebrews 10, we read verse 25. But I want you to see the verses leading up to verse 25. This is where he's giving these encouragements, this exhortation to hold fast. I'm going to begin in Hebrews 10, verse 19. Therefore, brethren, having boldness. You see, the word therefore, what does therefore do in a sentence? Always does what? It always draws a conclusion, okay? From all that I have said, says the writer, from everything that I've given you, here now is a conclusion. Whenever you see the word therefore, you need to go back and see what it's there for, okay? What's behind it. And what's behind it is all this stuff about the superiority of the new covenant. All that's behind it is about the superiority of Jesus. And so since we've got a better sacrifice, since we've got a better covenant, therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus. He says we should be bold. To enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus by a new and living way. Not the old way of the old law, but a new and living way which he consecrated for us through the veil that is his flesh, and having a high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart, full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed from pure water. Let us hold fast. There's your key. Verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works. And here now, he says, because we've got the superior Savior, superior covenant, we ought now to encourage one another. We ought to stir one another up. We need to hold fast to what we have. We need to draw near to God. All these things here, this is what we mean by exhortation. Exhortation means encouragement. And so you've got these words of encouragement at the end of chapter 10. Then he goes into chapter 11. And in chapter 11, it's what's sometimes called the honor roll of the Old Testament, where it mentions all these people who by faith overcame. And he says, look, these people, they're like, it could be compared to running a race. And here you've got the spectators in the stands, and here you are on the track. And all these who are in the stands are those who have already completed the race. And so it's like all these people that are mentioned here, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, David, Moses, and so many other people, they have already run the race. And chapter 11 says, look, if these people made it, if they were able to serve God and be effective in serving God, you can too. That's the idea of encouragement. Now, sometimes people take Hebrews chapter 11 and say, well, Hebrews chapter 11 is about condemning people. Well, you know, I suppose there's a sense in which that's true. Condemning people, meaning this, that if you drop out, you quit on Jesus, well, these in chapter 11 are going to stand up in condemnation against you. And it says, we made it, you're a quitter. But that's not the point of the chapter. The point of the chapter is that these made it, and so can you. He starts the chapter by speaking of a great cloud of witnesses, that these are witnesses that have run the race before us, and we can do that too. He continues in chapter number 12 by using this figure of the race. He says in verse 12 there, chapter 12, verse 1, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus. Here's the finish line. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And so here we run the race of faith with endurance. And then in the last chapter, chapter 13, the writer has what I would regard as a bunch of one-liners. One-liners, what I mean by that, here's a single statement, something you need to remember. Now here's something else, and then something else. These final statements almost stand alone, like as an example, in verse 4, marriage is honorable among all, the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. There he addresses the issue of marriage and faithfulness. In verse 7, he talks about those who are the overseers of the church. In verse 8, he just reminds the people that Jesus is unchangeable. In verse number 9, he says, don't be tossed to and fro by various and strange doctrines. He just gives a number of concluding thoughts to encourage the brethren to serve God, to love one another, and to be faithful. Well, that really is a kind of a summary of the book of Hebrews. Now, who's got a question? Question or comment? Anyone on this side? Anyone on this side? Bill. Matthew 17, the Transfiguration, verses 1 through 5. You have in that text Peter, James, and John, who go up on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus, and there God causes to miraculously appear on that mount Moses and Elijah. Bill, what do Moses and Elijah represent? What do you think? Okay, Elijah, one of the great prophets of the Old Testament, and Moses, the great lawgiver. So here you have a representation of the law and the prophets. You've got Moses who gave the law. Of course, Moses was a prophet too. But Elijah, as far as the oral prophets go, there was probably not a greater oral prophet than Elijah. So here you have the great lawgiver and the great prophet. And here is Jesus. And these three disciples looking at this marvelous sight as Jesus is transfigured before them. And then a voice comes from heaven. And what does the voice say? This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear him. Listen to him. And stop and think about that. Here's the great lawgiver, but the message is not through the great lawgiver. Here's the great prophet. The message is not through the prophets. The message for this dispensation then is through the Son. And so what do you see on the Mount of Transfiguration? You see the superiority of Jesus over Moses, the superiority of Jesus over the prophets, which is what we see here in our first point in Hebrews, the first 8 chapters. Good observation, Bill. I'd never put that together linking it to Hebrews, but it certainly does connect. Thank you. Who else? Comment, question? Clarence?
I thought it was interesting where he shows that Christ is certainly superior to the angels, yet he became lesser to come to earth to fulfill his mission.
Yeah. Think about this. Here are the angels. Okay, we could chart this, I guess, if we had a board we could mark on. Here's God. Here are the angels. Are the angels greater than men? Oh, yes. No question about that. Psalm number 2 makes that clear, and other places in the Old Testament. Everyone agrees angels are greater than men. So you look at 3 levels here. Here is deity in heaven. Here are the angels in heaven. Here are men on earth. Okay? Step down, step down. And here, deity is going to come to earth, but not come to earth as an angel. Deity comes to earth as a man. And even though the angels are superior, Jesus came to earth as a man, and yet he, in his essence, is greater than the angels, isn't he? And that's the argument that is made in chapter 1 and even going into chapter 2. We'll see much more about that when we get into the text itself, and I'm eager to do that, but we're not quite ready. Clarence, did you have more? Was there another hand I saw? Comment, question. Larry.
We all understand the superiority of Christ, but we also need to understand the importance of that sacrifice that he made.
Larry points out we all understand the superiority of Christ, but we need to understand the importance of the sacrifice he made. And that brings really to another sub-point that's inside of chapter 10, that there were sacrifices under the Old Testament, but the sacrifices under the Old Testament were inferior to the sacrifice that Jesus made. See, everything about the new covenant is superior to the old. And stop and think about this. The book of Hebrews, if it does anything at all, it teaches us that we're not under the old covenant. Agreed? We all understand that. And yet, the book of Hebrews, think about it, folks, it makes no sense at all if we're still under the old covenant. The point that he's making is that in every respect the old covenant was inferior. And furthermore, you cannot, it is impossible, you cannot be under the old covenant and under the new at the same time. Now, I know that a lot of people think, well, it's all the Bible, we should follow all the Bible. You don't make animal sacrifices. And there's only a few people on earth today who are abusing the Bible trying to make animal sacrifices. You can't keep that. The sacrifices of the temple, and what about the ordinances of the temple itself? The high priest going into the most holy place once a year. Nobody can do that. There is no temple on earth today. God does not have a physical temple. Instead, what he has is a body of believers who serve as his temple today. There's so much to be grasped about that. You cannot read the book of Hebrews. You cannot read the book of Hebrews and conclude that we're under the Old Testament law. But a majority of people, in America at least, believe that we're under the Old Testament law. I remember many years ago when I was preaching in Noblesville, Indiana, someone invited me to a revival service, and I don't remember what kind of church it was. It's really not significant. But I went to the revival service. It was just a few miles north of where I lived. And I listened to the denominational preacher preach, and he went back to the Old Testament law, picking bits and pieces out of the law and saying, we must keep these ordinances of God's law. And when the service was over, I waited patiently until everyone had left, and then I went and spoke to the man about what he had just taught, that we are under these commandments of the Old Testament law. I'm not talking about principles in the book of Hebrew or in the book of Proverbs. You know, the book of Proverbs has a lot of principles by which we live. The book of Proverbs warns about going into debt. It warns about how you treat your neighbor. I mean, it's got 100 different principles. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about specific ordinances that were part of Moses' law. As an example, the tithe, the giving of 10% of one's income, that was part of Moses' law. And it was practiced by Abraham prior to the law, just like circumcision was practiced by Abraham prior to the law. But when the law was given, the tithe, circumcision, the priesthood, and numerous other things were all tied together as part of that covenant. But I went to the gentleman after the service was over, and I said, we're not under that Old Testament law. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, what you taught tonight, going back and picking out 2 or 3 things from the law, those things are strictly related to the law and they're not part of the new covenant. He said, I don't understand what you mean. It's the Word of God. Well, of course it's the Word of God. But the Old Testament law is the Word of God for a different time and for a different people. The people of Israel, the time prior to the cross. From Sinai to the cross, that's the period governed by the law of Moses. I said, we have a New Testament. That old covenant has been taken away. That's why it's called the Old Covenant or the First Covenant. It's been taken away. And I opened my Bible and I read to him from Hebrews chapter 9, verses 15 through 18, and talked about how that a testament becomes a force after men are dead. In verse number 17, talking about when Jesus died, that inaugurated the New Testament, and we're no longer under the Old. And I promise you, folks, I'm not making this up. He said to me, what kind of Bible is that? I've never heard of anything like that. Now, this is a man going across the country as an evangelist preaching revival services. And I said, sir, my Bible is the same as yours. It is the King James Version. You preached out of it tonight. That's what I have in my hand. That's what I just read. He said, well, that's not in my Bible. I said, then let's look in your Bible. And sure enough, it was there. And he didn't know it. He had no concept of the end of the law of Moses. Folks, the law of Moses governed the people of Israel from Mount Sinai. When they made their covenant with God, at the base of Mount Sinai, Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments, the 2 tables of stone, and in addition to that, Moses had about 600 other commandments that he gave in the book of Exodus and Leviticus and in Numbers and Deuteronomy, about 600 more commandments. That law, given at Sinai, governed the people from that time up to the time of the cross. Now, you've got a time of transition after the cross, because on Pentecost, the new covenant is introduced, and people become New Testament Christians and on the day of Pentecost. But the book of Colossians, the book of Ephesians, the book of Galatians, the book of Romans, they all talk about how the old covenant ended. It ended at the cross, and now we live under a new and better covenant. That's the message of the book of Hebrews. We have a new and better covenant. And he was astounded to learn that his Bible had information like that. And I guess, and I'm not sure how a person can really be a Bible student and not grasp that concept. But do you realize that the majority of preachers who live in Beaumont, Texas, or in the state of Texas, or across the country, or around the world, the majority of preachers will teach, oh yes, we've got to keep that covenant made at Sinai. We are under the 10 Commandments. We've got to keep those. Well, we're under the gospel. And it's interesting, the gospel contains 9 of the same principles that are found in the 10 Commandments. Which one is not found in the gospel? The Sabbath, commandment number 4. And what day of the week is the Sabbath? I mean, we say it all the time. What day of the week? It's Saturday, it's not Sunday. Someone says, oh no, it's got to be Sunday because we have to keep the 10 Commandments. We keep the gospel. And the gospel says, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. The gospel teaches you should not steal, you should not lie. But these principles are so critically important to understand, and so few people really understand them. Okay, anything else? Question, comment? Yes, ma'am.
The reason most people get so confused about the law, the old law or the law of Moses, is all they know of the old law or the law of Moses and consider it the same thing are the 10 Commandments.
Okay, Peggy is making the point that one of the reasons that so many people are confused is that all they know of the law is the 10 Commandments, and that indeed is right. That's most people, if you ask them what other commandments are found in the law besides the 10 Commandments, most people I don't think could name 4 or 5, and yet there are 600 more, okay? And all these things about purification, sacrifices, feast days, 600 more commandments. But if all you know is about the 10 Commandments, and you don't understand that that law was given only to the people of Israel, not to the other nations, then you're going to be confused. And by the way, there were 2 things that God gave to the Israelite people, to the offspring of Abraham, 2 things that he gave that set them apart from the other peoples of the earth. Can you name those 2 things? We've already mentioned one. The Sabbath, and what was the other? I think someone said it starts with a C. Circumcision. And both of those were designed to say, this is a separate people. And God made it very clear that the Sabbath was a sign between him and the people of Israel. And think about it, folks. If the Sabbath was given to the whole world, how could it be a sign between God and Israel? It was something to mark them as special. And same thing is true of the circumcision. Seed of Abraham, the offspring of Abraham were all circumcised. But that circumcision wasn't given to the whole world. It was given only to Abraham's offspring. One other thing as we close, we've only got a couple minutes left. I want you to look at page 3, at the bottom of the page. There are 6 key warnings in the book of Hebrews. And we'll note just a couple of them. And it's interesting that all of these, you can remember them with a D. There's a warning against drifting away from God. There's a warning against departing from God. There's a warning against disobedience to God. There's a warning against dullness of hearing. There's a warning against despising Christ, and a warning against defiance against God. It's kind of interesting. All those can be identified with a D. But notice just one of them in chapter 2. In chapter 2, beginning at verse number 1, and here's the warning against drifting. And listen, some translations may use different words. The principle is still the same. In chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, therefore we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. For if the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a just reward, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed to us by those who heard him? Notice there's the warning against drifting away. And then as you look at chapter 3, a warning against departing from the living God. And we see these warnings. Why? Why are these warnings given? Well, it goes back to our basic premise, that this is written to these Hebrew Christians who are drifting. It's written to these Hebrew Christians who are being persecuted, who are thinking about departing. And if they depart, they're in disobedience to God. And so you can see why these warnings are given. Well, we're not going to look at any more of that this evening. This coming Sunday morning, we will go right into the text. And I've got on page 4 study questions on the book of Hebrews. Now, the way I've laid out your workbook, this is almost like a workbook commentary. I don't have a whole lot of questions. You know, on each section, I could give you 10 or 15 questions. But what I've done instead, I've given you a little synopsis of what the section is about, and then given you 2 or 3 questions. Like on page 4, all you have is a total of 3 questions on that page. Now you go to page 5, and you've got about a dozen, 12 or 13 questions, but it deals with an entire chapter. And page 6, you've got about 6 or 7 questions. But I've given you this little commentary to help guide you in your study a little bit. Okay, we're completely out of time. The kids are about to come in, and let's go back to our seats. Thank you tonight for being here. May God bless us all.